So the really frightening element for that, and this is one of my driving points for why it matters, even if you don't have anything to hide or think you don't have anything to hide, is that that's the wrong question. The real question is, what do you have that's worth protecting?
I'm Dr. Duke with The New American, joined today by Mitchell Shaw. Mitchell is a contributor to The New American magazine, and he is the host of the Enemy of the Surveillance State podcast. Mitchell, talk a little bit about your podcast. What do you do?
Well, first, Duke, it's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for having me. So the idea behind the podcast really comes out of the fact that I was that privacy nerd before being a privacy nerd was cool, right? So I was the guy telling everybody that the NSA was listening in and the other federal agencies were listening in. Nosy corporations were spying on our data, harvesting our data, and I was crazy. Right up until Ed Snowden released all of his information to journalists, and then all of a sudden I wasn't crazy anymore. So I started to dig down a lot deeper and try to figure out what I could do to protect my personal privacy. And I found some things that I began to implement. I read everything I could get my hands on from all of the experts in the field. And then years later, began to talk about doing a podcast about this. And that went on for quite a while. And finally, my wife said, "Hey, you know that podcast you keep talking about doing?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Would you either do that or stop talking about it?" And so I said, "Okay, well, then I guess I'm going to do it." Launched in February. And the idea, the tagline of the podcast is a place of news, tips, and open source tools to help you protect your privacy in an age of mass digital surveillance. Because it's not just about the three-letter agencies, et cetera, that are harvesting our data. It's about what I like to call a culture of surveillance, or surveillance as a feature, a la Google, Facebook, Microsoft. They go for the low-hanging fruit. They don't have to hack my device if I've already hacked it for them by granting some unaccountable corporation access to all of the data flow coming in and out of all of my devices. So I talk to my listeners about the different steps and what have you that they can take to do that.
So, yeah, that's a pretty great resume, and we really need more people like you on the wall here. Let me ask you, before we get into our topic, out of curiosity, what do you do immediately because I think there'd be a lot of interested people at home. How do you avoid the surveillance search, the big surveillance state, when you're working on your own computer? Just any quick tips off the top of your head for things people can do to minimize the surveillance?
Well, this is where the script calls for me to tell everybody to switch to Linux. And while I would advocate for that, I realize that there are a lot of people who are not going to be able to ditch Windows or Mac to switch to a Linux operating system just because they have things that their work requires. The lowest level things that I think people could do are to change their search engine. Just never, ever again Google anything. If you need to see Google results, you could use Start Page as your search engine. Start Page returns Google results without you having a relationship with Google. In essence, they act as a man in the middle. So it would be like me turning to my friend and saying, "Hey, man, I don't want to use Google, but will you Google something for me and tell me what you find?" Start Page does that and just returns those results to my screen just as if I had Googled it. Another great search engine is DuckDuckGo. So between those two, I'm able to find anything I want to find without having to have a relationship with Google. There are some other things that people can do, some other privacy services that people can use, switching away from things like Gmail or other web-based email programs or services to something like Proton Mail, which I've used for years and really love. And then, of course, a good privacy-oriented VPN or virtual private network is a great thing. I use Proton VPN. It's like $10 a month for up to 5 devices. I don't have an affiliate program with them. They don't pay me to hawk their services. I've just used them for years and really like what they're doing. So I would say that if somebody was doing those handful of things right there, they would have already gone a long way toward protecting the privacy of their laptop or their desktop computer.
For the vast majority of Americans for whom this information has not even yet been heard, talk about what's going on with the surveillance state right now. If you had to survey the field right now, give us the dire overview of what's going on in our country with regards to turning this country, once free country, into a surveillance state.
Well, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the idea of surveillance as a feature or a culture of surveillance. I'm 49 years old, so I grew up in a world where people considered private things private. But there's a generation that has already come up and another generation that's coming up that really has never even thought about that. It's just not even on their radar. They've always been surveilled, so they've never known what it is to not be surveilled. And the big question I get from those folks all the time is, hey, what's the big deal? I don't have anything to hide. So I actually did the very first episode. I decided to address that issue in the very first episode of my podcast, Enemy of the Surveillance State. The title of that episode is Why Surveillance Matters, Even If You Have Nothing to Hide. So in that, I talk about some of Ed Snowden's revelations and an interview that he did on television from Russia. It was his first appearance. American journalist, I forget now who, went over to interview him, and there's actually a sound clip of that in that very first episode where he says that he realized that they had the ability to surveil people in real time. Now, let me pause for a second in there and say, what we're not talking about is some guy sitting in a dusty basement with headphones and a fedora and a stinky cigar actually listening in one-to-one real time. What they're doing is they're capturing all of this data flow, whether it's a text communication, a telephone call, an email communication, your browsing history, your maps, your calendars, whatever else. And what Snowden realized is that they have the ability to store that in perpetuity and go back through it later in real time. So the really frightening element for that, and this is one of my driving points for why it matters, even if you don't have anything to hide or think you don't have anything to hide, is that that's the wrong question. The real question is, what do you have that's worth protecting? Because since they can go back through that in real time, Duke, what they're able to do is go back and see that I was typing out an email and I typed a clause and I didn't really like it. So I paused for a second and a half and I backspaced over that clause. I paused for 3/4 of a second and then I typed a brand new clause. Since they can see that entire timeline, they're able to use psychological profiling techniques not just to see my finished product. That would be bad enough. But they're actually able to figure out why I wrote what I wrote. They're able to figure out my thought processes for why I didn't like the clause I didn't like and why I chose the phrase that I did choose. And that ought to frighten anyone, because since they're able to gather this information on everyone, what we wind up with is a dossier on you that shows your maps, your calendars, of course, your locations. It shows your emails, your texts, your phone calls, who you know, who they know, and all of this. And another thing Ed Snowden said is that, and I didn't include the sound clip in that episode of the podcast, but what he said is, in essence, and I'm paraphrasing some here, because they have the ability to do all of that for you, Duke, and everybody you know and everybody they know, here's what I come up with. They have the ability to know that 3 weeks from today, you're going to get a text or an email or a phone call from somebody you've not talked to in 5 or 10 years. He's going to be passing through town and he's going to say, hey, Duke, let's get together for a cup of coffee. Because they know all of your habits, all of his habits, all of your other friends' habits, all of your neighbors' habits, they're able to predict that you're going to say yes. They know where and when you're going to meet. They know the beverage you're going to order. They know how you're going to pay for it. They know the question your friend is going to ask you, and they already know your answer. And you don't even know he's going to call you yet. So that's far.
Is this similar to, how advertisers, people tell the story all the time? I was sitting in my bedroom talking to my wife, and I mentioned a pair of Croc shoes, and all of a sudden, 5 minutes later, boom, there was an ad on my. Is this more or less the same thing?
It's very much the same thing. So, and I'll have to tell this very, very quickly because I see we're coming up on a break. But Target department stores, everybody has shopped at a Target at one point or another. They have the red card. It's their way of knocking 5% off your purchase. It basically acts as a debit card tied to your checking account, right? And the reason they're willing to undertake all of the overhead and the infrastructure of maintaining that and knock 5% off your purchase, you got to ask what's in it for them, right? Well, what's in it for them is that it ties all of your purchases together into a single profile because you're always going to use that card. You're always going to identify yourself as that customer. They have an algorithm that can predict purchases so well that they predicted a teenage girl's pregnancy before her own father knew she was pregnant.
That's frightening and remarkable. We're almost at the break here. We're going to come back on the other side of the break and talk a little bit more. Quick question for you that you can answer quickly. Do you think Donald Trump should pardon Snowden?
Oh, I do. Absolutely. First, I think it would be a major win for him. And I think justice requires that he pardon Ed Snowden. And he would leave the Democrats in shambles if he pardoned Snowden, because Obama promised to or hinted that he would and then didn't.
And so it was on the table for a while with Trump. He hasn't mentioned it recently. Do you think the ship has sailed?
I don't know. I hope not. I know there's a big Twitter campaign right now, hashtag pardon Snowden, and it's still gaining ground.
Mitchell Shaw, we'll see you on the other side. I'm Dr. Duke with The New American, joined today by Mitchell Shaw, an old friend of the program. Mitchell is a contributor to The New American magazine. He's also the host of the popular podcast, Enemy of the Surveillance State. We all ought to be enemies of the surveillance state. And I want to get a little macro on you. Last time we talked, we did some micro issues here about personal security, how do individuals protect themselves. Let's talk about the big 800-pound elephant in the room, the November election, which is going to be just a disaster on a number of fronts in terms of absentee voting or vote by mail. All the tech companies that are cracking down, particularly on conservative speech. I noticed that the liberals are getting away with saying things that the right gets smacked down for. But give me your overall impression right now about how much is the surveillance state interfering right now in our election, and what kind of things can we expect in the last month and a half?
Okay, so again, just for the viewers, to clarify, when I say the surveillance state, I mean both the surveillance state proper, the three-letter agencies, and the culture of surveillance with nosy corporations like Facebook, Google, et cetera, Microsoft. So how are they manipulating the vote? Well, we saw in 2016 Facebook going out of their way to manipulate the vote with emoticons. And I wrote a lot about this for The New American at the time, but there was an awful lot. And then Google was, of course, filtering searches. If anybody did a search in 2016 for Hillary Clinton, CRI, and it autofills, it didn't autofill to criminal activities. It autofilled to Crimea. Okay. Now, if I did that same search on DuckDuckGo and it autofilled to crime activities or criminal activities, because they knew that's what I was looking for. Google did everything they could to make it difficult for me to find that information. So big tech is fully on board with manipulating elections. And of course, we saw it with the Cambridge Analytica leaks from Facebook in 2016 as well. So I tend to think, when you go down the rabbit holes that I've gone down to learn to protect privacy, you think a lot about what are called threat models. Like, what is it I'm trying to protect, right? What is it that I know I have to be careful of when I open this browser versus that browser, or I have to disconnect my VPN to do this. What do I have open before I disconnect that VPN? When you begin to think like that, you begin to think a little bit like a hacker, because you're thinking like the bad guy that's trying to get in. Now, when I say hacker in this regard, I mean in the broad sense. I mean the guy who jerry rigs an antenna for his FM radio is in a sense a hacker. He's using a coat hanger to bring in an FM reception because it'll get the job done. So thinking like that, I just stopped and had a conversation with myself the other day about mail-in voting. And I thought, we know from the 2018-19 elections here in Virginia that the Chinese communists were heavily involved in door knocking. They created the maps. This was done at a university in China. The maps that were used for Democrats to knock on doors here in Virginia were created in China. So they knew which neighborhoods to go to, got demographic information, Duke, and we know where the majority of conservative voters in any area live. If they're putting their votes in a mailbox, divert the mail from those neighborhoods. You'll lose a handful of Democrat voters, but you'll lose all of the Republican voters. You'll lose a few liberals, but you'll lose all of the conservatives, and that's all that it takes. So mail-in voting is a train wreck in progress, not even waiting to happen. It's a train wreck in progress.
Why is the Trump government not contesting any of this in court?
I have no idea. I don't know what my thinking on Donald Trump has changed a lot over the last few years, the last 3 years. I know that sometimes he is considerably ahead of the curve, and though it looks like he's kind of dragging behind and doesn't know what's going on, he's planning his next move sometimes, and I don't know what that move is here. So it kind of goes back to your question earlier about whether Donald Trump should pardon Ed Snowden. I think he should, and I think he should make it a shocking surprise. He should just come out of left field and knock that one out of the park and leave the Democrats wondering what just happened. And that he may have something in the works where mail-in voting is concerned, but of course, I have no way to know what that is. I just know that mail-in voting is a hacker's dream.
Right, and Trump has spoken out vociferously against it, but there doesn't seem to be any challenge coming forth, which doesn't make any sense to me. Let's talk, while we're on this topic here, about the ways in which Facebook, we know how the CIA, the FBI, those groups do what they do, but Facebook, Twitter, these companies in particular, I noticed that Twitter has actually suspended videos from Donald Trump because of these weird, bizarre fact checks, right? I mean, niggling little things that are contestable. Meanwhile, you're seeing the campaign of Biden and Harris saying really shocking things that are demonstrably not true, and that all sails through. Have we become, as a culture, used to this now? Have we just decided as a race of people, a nation of people, that we know they're going to cheat on the left with these things? We'd still rather use their platforms than to have fairness. Is that where we are?
I think it is. I think that Thomas Paine said in the preface to Common Sense, he said, a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a false sense of being right. We are creatures of habit. We get so used to using something like Facebook and Twitter and we get so used to being shocked by them that it doesn't really shock us anymore. We expect to be the redheaded stepchildren at the card table when it comes to those conversations. My father was just a blue-collar guy, and he loved to play poker. So when I was about 8 years old, my dad taught me a really valuable lesson that has always stuck with me. He says, when you're older, you sit down at a table full of guys you don't know to play cards with money you can't afford to lose. You look around the table and see if you can spot the sucker. If you cannot spot the sucker, put your money back in your pocket and leave that table because you're him. And when we sit down at the table with liberals to have a cordial conversation and negotiate, we can't spot the sucker because it's us. We're there to be taken for a ride, and we keep letting it happen. It's such an altruism. It doesn't even need to be said that big data manipulates data for the sake of liberal politics. It happens so often. It's a trope. We know it's real, and we just ignore it. And we have to stop ignoring it because, like you say, a conservative can post a video about Donald Trump and it'll be taken down in no time flat. The Biden-Harris campaign can make these insane claims, and their videos stay up and get traction. But it's more than that. There's shadow banning, where the platform uses an algorithm to decide who's going to see what. And so the example that I used years ago, and I'll use it here, it's not a one-to-one comparison to this, but I have it ready to go, so I'll pull it out. Some 13-year-old girl in Des Moines can post a Facebook comment about how she believes that marriage is between one man and one woman for life. And she's not going to get any likes. She's not going to get no one's going to repost her comment because nobody saw her comment. She got shadow banned. So she thinks her comment is highly unpopular. But some other 13-year-old somewhere in Sheboygan, wherever that is, can post all about rainbow pride and LGBTQ this and LGBTQ that. And Facebook and Twitter will make sure that everybody and his sister sees that post. She gets lots of retweets, reposts, likes and comments, and now all of a sudden her opinion is popular. It's not really a barometer of what is popular or unpopular. It's a barometer of what the agenda is behind the platform that's running those. So it's manipulation 101. It's very, very simple. If you control the flow of data that people see, you control how they perceive things.
Last quick question. We got about half a minute for this left. Tell us what kind of chaos, knowing what you know about surveillance state, the surveillance state, what's going to happen in November? What kind of dissembling and chaos is going to be unleashed by these programs?
Oh, I think by the time it's over, we're going to see them using because again, they get to harvest your opinions, your thoughts, your attitudes, and they're going to use those to manipulate the way people vote right before the election. I don't know what it's going to be, but I expect that there's going to be something major that's going to come up that's going to be a real reason to vote to the left.
Mitchell Shaw, we only got about 30 seconds left. So take a few seconds and tell people where they can find your work. How can they find the podcast? When does the podcast air? How do they access it?
So you can find it at enemyofsurveillance.podbean.com or anywhere where you listen to podcasts. It's listed on all the major services. Just do a search for Enemy of the Surveillance State, and be sure to subscribe so that you'll get notifications. It's free to subscribe, but that way you'll get notifications every time I post a new episode. It's a little erratic right now. I try to do it about every other week.
Every other week. Mitchell Shaw, I really recommend that podcast. Thanks for joining us.